Parliament is asking the public to make written comments on the Public Procurement Bill. The bill has been amended to take into account abuses in procurement highlighted by the Zondo Commission. The aim is to prevent tender corruption. But what does this mean in practical terms for individuals and businesses that are currently doing business with government? Kganki Matabane, Chief Executive Officer of the Black Business Council, joins us now to unpack this. Kganki, I appreciate your time this evening. Now, just give us a summary of some of those findings from the Zondo Commission.
Good evening, Hugo, and the viewers of Newzroom Afrika. We, as the BBC, we view this legislation as the most important legislation, second to only the Constitution. And we're saying that because anyone who wants to do business with the organs of state and anyone who's planning in future to do business with the organs of state needs to have interest in this, especially looking at the history where we come from as South Africans, where there were categories of people who were not allowed to do business, and there were categories of people who were discriminated against. So this legislation is going to replace the current legislation, what that we call Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act. This is the Act of 2000. So this Act has been there for 23 years. And in that 23 years, we have not seen state procurement being utilized properly to implement what we call the Section 2172 of the Constitution, which basically said we need to develop a policy that will make sure that the sections of the population that were discriminated are taken care of, so that we can have what we call set aside. So we set aside certain procurement, certain percentage of the procurement for certain groups. Like the president has always been talking about 40% set aside for women businesses, and they can be set aside for youth. They can be set aside for people living with disabilities. They can be set aside for black people. But the current legislation that we have does not allow for set aside. So hence we're calling for everyone to say this is an opportunity that you must be interested, because one way or the other you're going to be affected.
So let's talk about the main barriers preventing women-owned enterprises from participating in major deals and high-value procurement opportunities. What are some of those issues?
The main thing, for example, when we look at the organs of state, the main barrier is the legislation. As I was giving an example about the 40% that the president always talks about, that 40% or any other set aside is not in any legislation in South Africa. So unless we put it in a legislation, the procurement officers of the organs of state, and by organs of state, I mean the government, national, provincial, municipal, state organs, and other SOCs, for example. Those ones, they only implement legislation. So anything that is not in the legislation, they are not going to implement. So hence, we at the BBC, we've been calling for the PPPFA to be reviewed for the past 10 years, because we realize that it is not empowering the previously disadvantaged as it was supposed to do.
Well, Kganki, in your view, what funding and support mechanisms are needed to advance the interests of women entrepreneurs and young people in procurement? Because it's not as simple as saying, here is legislation, set aside 40% of the business for young people or for women, because they need to be upskilled. They may not have the capacity to provide or bid for certain services.
Yes, I think capacity you build it over time, but the most important thing, because what this legislation seeks to do is to create a market, or what we call access to the market. Once you've got access to the market, it becomes relatively easier to get access to funding, because you go to any funding institution, either an SOC funding institution or a normal bank, and you say to them, I do have this off-take agreement, I do have this tender, or I do have this a contract. It becomes relatively easier to raise funds when you've got a contract with you, because the funding institution can de-risk using the contract. But in the absence of the market, even if someone gives you money now and say, Hugo, this is 50 million, go and start a business, where do you start? Because you still need to have access to the market. And the intention of the Public Procurement Bill, in our view, is to make sure that women, black people, youth, people living with disabilities have that access to the market. And then they can then be able to raise funds.
But Kganki, one of the biggest challenges that most SMEs or small businesses owned by black people, particularly businesses owned by women, has been a cry about getting financial support from the banks, right? Is there a conversation that's being had on the sidelines with financial institutions that have capacity to lend these individuals? Because it doesn't necessarily follow that if I go to a bank, or if you go to a bank, or certainly any of these benefactors go in with an order and say, I've got an off-taker, that they will immediately get financial support.
Yes, I'm not discounting the challenges that we still have regarding funding. We do have, in South Africa, we lack what you call high-risk funding. So if you go to any developmental financial institution like the IDC, the CFAs and so on, their criteria is sometimes even more difficult than going to a normal bank. So we still need, after this procurement legislation, we still need to come up with another legislation that deals with access to funding, where.
But if we, allow me to interject. But if we are waiting another 5 years to then develop that legislation and not trying to develop it simultaneously, are we not losing a lot of time? Because I'd imagine that if this legislation is passed eventually in another 12 or 24 months, and then we wait to pass another legislation that takes another 36 to 72 months, we've lost time, and half the individuals that we're supposed to benefit are no longer in some of these categories, like young people, for instance.
Yes, I think some of the challenges don't necessarily even need the legislation. Like for government funding institutions, for example, when we realized that there's only one institution that was formed after 1994, and that was formed specifically and precisely to fund black business, which is the National Empowerment Fund. But what has not happened is that the National Empowerment Fund was only given funds for the first year. It was never again be given more money or be recapitalized. So that doesn't need a legislation. That needs pressure from everyone else who's involved, including ourselves. And we've been putting this pressure to government to say, give national empowerment more money, because that is the only institution that was formed to support black business, women-owned business, youth-owned businesses. Give them more money so that they can then support a small business and make sure that those businesses grow to become medium businesses, big businesses, so that they can create jobs. So we are not necessarily waiting and say, we're waiting for this legislation, then we can sort out the funding later. We're busy putting pressure on government, mainly because we are of the serious view that we need our own government, like the previous government did, to empower our own people.
So how do we stop all of this from abuse? And when I talk about abuse, I'm talking about a situation where a woman receives an order, but unfortunately the financial institution does not, or there are no financial institutions to support her, and then Kganki or Hugo come along and say for 60% of that order we will fund the business, or in any other tabulation of abuse for that matter.
Yes, I think what we've been calling for people was that they should report those type of abuse situations to us as well, and we'll take this matter up, because I agree with you. You don't want to get access to the market, and then on the other side there's no funding, but then they get abused by people who've got funding.
But so sorry, are these people not shooting themselves in the foot then? Because I mean, why would I want to come out and report someone who's funding this person. I mean, it's a little bit like loan sharks, you know. You don't go and report them because they're serving a purpose, because the legal or the legitimate options are unavailable. So it almost suggests that it is open to abuse if we are not harnessing those tools that are critical. And one of those tools is availability of funding.
Yes, I agree with you, but there's always going to be abuse, but the reason why we say the abuse must be reported, and it can be reported anonymously. It doesn't have to be saying I'm company A, I've got issues with company B. You can report it anonymously so that we can take it up and with whoever is involved, without exposing the person who has been helped. Because again, you are right, people are fearful that maybe if I do this type of reporting, there may be repercussions. And I think, again, one of the things that we want to see in the Public Procurement Bill is how do we protect whistleblowers? Because you have seen a lot of instances where whistleblowers, they go and report people for corruption, tender corruption, and any other procurement corruption. And at the end of the day, they lose their livelihood, they lose their jobs, lose their houses, and lose everything. And they find it very, very difficult to be appointed or reappointed anywhere else. So what we're calling for is that there must be a special fund that will look after whistleblowers. Like, for example, these other monies that people who are caught doing corruption, they must pay that money to a certain fund, and a special fund that will look after whistleblowers. So that once you've risked your life and risked your livelihood by blowing the whistle, you must be looked after as if you are still gainfully employed.
I think that's a noble idea. It also raises the issues around how do you envision law enforcement entities effectively monitoring and investigating procurement irregularities, without automatic access to procurement data.
Yes, and I think before I forget, we're calling for everyone, because the submissions of the documents that are going to be presented for Public Procurement Bill, those documents are supposed to be sent to Parliament by 12 o'clock on Monday, 11th September. And then the presentation itself is going to be made on the 12th and the 13th of September. But for you to be able to make a presentation, you must firstly submit the presentation. And we're saying, even you, Hugo, because I'm sure one day we're going to be affected by this. If you don't have the submission, the Black Business Council has got the submission, you can take our submission and go and submit it and go and present it to Parliament, because we need as many people as possible to go and make the presentation, because the anti-transformation lobby people are going to do the same. They prepare one presentation and then they give it to everyone else, and then they go and say we don't like transformation. So BBC is ready with this own presentation that it can be shared with anyone else who wants to be part of this, because we feel and we think this is very important.
So obviously this is one aspect to the advocacy that you're carrying out and creating that necessary awareness. So how else are you speaking to individuals and small businesses out there in the marketplace to support this initiative and obviously meet that 11th September deadline?
Yes, we do have a lot of subcommittees at the BBC that are busy dealing with this matter. We've called upon all our members, but even non-members, because they're going to be affected. One day you leave your job, you want to do business with the organs of state, you're going to find that there's this legislation that has been passed that basically blocks you from being able to access opportunities. So any South African is going to be impacted one or the other at some stage. So hence we are saying this is very, very, very important, second only to the Constitution of South Africa, and we're calling everyone, and we were saying we do have the presentation ourselves. If anyone wants a copy, we've got a copy, and then they can go and present the same presentation to Parliament.
Kganki Matabane, appreciate your time, Chief Executive Officer of the Black Business Council.